Hi guys, I just had a chat with Nic Dean. Nic Dean specializes in creating MOGRTs and toolkits, and this is very, very helpful in creating motion systems, so you don't have to recreate assets over and over again. Nick took us through his process of creating MOGRTs. He took us through conversation with clients, how he goes about creating functional and usable assets for clients. And he also gave us a demo of some projects he has worked on in the past. This is definitely an episode you wouldn't want to miss. So tell us a bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. So my name is Nic Dean, and I'm a motion designer. I make MOGRTs and After Effects templates and scripts and plugins for After Effects and Premiere Pro. And I have a small YouTube channel teaching YouTube tutorials mostly focused on MOGRTs.
Cool, awesome. That was a very short and precise intro. So why did you decide to niche within MOGRTs and toolkits?
Um, well, I've been using After Effects and the whole Adobe suite for more than 10 years. And After Effects is really my go-to piece of software. And MOGRTs came out in 2017. And I was really early on using them. I thought that they were instantly a really cool feature to add to your arsenal as a motion designer or just After Effects user. So I started using them right away on projects, making like lower thirds and intros and stuff for freelance work. And then in 2019, I was working in New York City, living there, doing a bunch of advertising work. And most of it was like general motion design, some video editing work, VFX, like just all the above. And I was doing work for like Amazon and Adidas and Versace and food and pharma and cosmetics and all over the place. But then one day I saw a job role pop up at Adobe Stock working with them in their MOGRT motion graphics template department. And I thought that was really interesting because I had already been using them in my own work and I knew that they were continuing to grow this feature. So I just applied cold. I didn't know anyone there. And I ended up getting the role and then working with them for a year and a half to help support that whole pipeline where individual people are submitting MOGRTs to Adobe Stock to host on their marketplace, and then people can buy those templates. So it was really that job where like I had some knowledge about MOGRTs and templates and stuff before going into that job, but then being there, I really learned a ton and really upgraded my knowledge because I was touching and reviewing and fixing dozens of MOGRTs every single day for almost 2 years.
Okay, Isaac, do you think the kind of job one gets, especially as a beginner motion designer, helps shape how your career path, or how important is it for shaping your career path, the kind of job you get or take?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it does shape it a lot. Because yeah, if you pick a company or a team to go work with and you're there for a year, multiple years, like that really shapes what you're learning and it really shapes how you learn to communicate or what sort of projects you're working on. And yeah, it shapes everything. So if you're going to go work full time somewhere, it's a big consideration of, is this a good team to go work for? Are you going to learn a lot that's going to help you in your career? And is it something that you want to be doing, 3-5 years from now? Because if it's not, then I would suggest not taking a full-time role with that company or that team and maybe just working freelance with them.
All right, sounds good. That's actually helpful advice. So what do you consider when creating MOGRTs and toolkits for brands? What are the things that come to your mind at first?
Yeah. So I think that the biggest thing to consider with making MOGRTs and toolkits is who is going to be using it. At the end of the day, are you building this for another motion designer? Or are you building a template for a video editor? Or are you building this for like a more junior artist or an intern or a producer who barely touches Adobe tools? there have been times where I've had to build templates and toolkits that I know a producer is going to have to jump into to version out shots. And your template and your project file has to be so much simpler if, a junior artist or intern is jumping on that project compared to a motion designer who uses After Effects every day. So that's really number one, is like, who is going to be using this after I build it? After that, I would consider technical specs, right? So like, sure, you have to know the resolution and the frame rate and those sort of considerations, but also you have to know what plugins are you going to use in this project. Is the end user going to have those same plugins, or are they not? Because if you use like Red Giant Universe or Limber or like a bunch of things in your project and you pass it off to someone else who doesn't have those plugins or isn't familiar with them, it might not work on their end. So you really have to be, again, that gets back to knowing like who the end user is going to be. And then I think the last one that I would say is really important is, how long is this template or toolkit meant to be used? So are you building a template for one project that's going to last a month? Like, I've been on projects where we're doing like 100 comps that are all like pretty similar. So it makes sense to build a toolkit or a template so we can version out 100 different shots. But at the end of the month, that project, that campaign is done. So we don't have to worry about, the overall brand lasting a year from now, or we don't have to worry about controls or compatibility issues a year from now. But if you're building other toolkits, that team might want that same toolkit, that same Mogrt, that same template to be working for them a year from now or 2 years from now. So that's a big consideration too.
Yeah. Sounds good. And interesting, you already started touching about the brand using this and also having the user in mind when creating. So the next question I would like to ask is, how important is using MOGRTs with general branding, right? Within the general branding scope, how important is it? How does it add? How does it help branding stand out?
Yeah, I think MOGRTs are really helpful. They're not the end all be all. There's something that I focus on a lot, and that's really what I specialize in and try to bring the most value in, is building MOGRTs and building like a package of MOGRTs. So like, it's not just like one template, it's a bunch of different templates that work together as a toolkit. But you can't only rely on MOGRTs. Sometimes you just need an After Effects template or a Premiere Pro template with a bunch of assets or a Photoshop template or whatever. So MOGRTs are really helpful, and I think that they're most helpful for people who want motion design but are scared of After Effects. So it's, in my experience, that's normally why people are asking me to build MOGRTs, is they want it for their video editing team, and their video editing team doesn't want to jump into After Effects. And so it's both because they don't want to and they're scared, and because it's just faster at the end of the day. If you build a good template and you can just drag it onto the timeline, change a few settings, and be done with that asset, it's so much faster than communicating with the motion design team, sending a request, having them render, send it back, realize that something is wrong, and then start that cycle all over again. So to me, that's where MOGRTs fit into the pipeline.
Okay. The question is, how do you go about understanding how best the MOGRT fits for a brand? Probably in conversation with a producer or a creative director or marketing or anyhow. Like, how do you go about understanding the particular need and knowing how to segment? Okay, this is going to be for a newbie, this is going to be for a more professional, or this is going to be for someone who's not really technical when it comes to design.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is like as important as building the project itself is communicating with the client and being able to have those conversations early on before you're building things. It's really important to discuss upfront what are the goals here? What is mandatory to build? What have you not thought about that I know is going to be a consideration? Like maybe you've decided, hey, we want these graphics, but have you discussed all of the aspect ratios you're going to use? Have you discussed, is this for broadcast or for social? And a big part of the way I like to work with teams is do an audit early on. So a lot of times building a toolkit or a template or a graphics package, in my experience, they normally have some assets already done. So whether that's like the brand guide or whether that's actual After Effects project files or whether it's videos that they've done, they'll often have a starting point and they'll say like, hey, we want to build this out into a package, into a toolkit. So I'll take a look at that. I'll take a look at the project files and check for those sort of technical things that are necessary for building the toolkit. Any hiccups, like are they mixing 3D and 2D? You know, 3D doesn't work great in MOGRTs. It's going to be really hard to update that. It also makes it really slow. Are they using just their brand font, or are they mixing a bunch of different fonts and colors? Is it locked really closely to their brand style, or is it more open? And so all of those things I'll try to do early on in an audit, and then base questions off of that before building anything.
Yeah. Okay, sounds good. So that means your process basically starts with an audit, then before commencing with the creation of MOGRTs or whatever assets you need to create. That sounds good. How do you, so once you've created, right, you've gotten the audit and you've done the creation, how do you go about testing? Because from our conversation so far, there's times you have to create hundreds of assets that fit in different scenarios. So how do you go about testing so you don't create hundreds of assets that don't function well or don't meet what the original need was?
Yeah, so testing is super important for building templates and toolkits. It's paramount because at the end of the day, a lot of what we're doing is mixing design and development. And in development, there can be bugs. Things can be broken. So when I'm building templates and MOGRTs and toolkits and writing expressions for clients, the V1 that they get, the V1 that they see, is not the V1. Like I will do dozens of versions before ever sending the client one, because I need to build it and test it and update it and change things based on what's either broken or what could be easier to use or could be faster to render. And so, like technically, if I'm building a MOGRT, I'll build it in After Effects, test it in After Effects, but then absolutely export it, open it in Premiere, and test every single control. Like it is not acceptable to build a MOGRT in After Effects and not test everything in Premiere, because Premiere does not always render everything the same as After Effects. And you might test things in After Effects, but then in Premiere, once you change all those controls, maybe they don't work together the way you envisioned. Or maybe the user experience isn't as clear as you thought it was. So it is paramount to test it the exact same way that someone's going to use it. Like test the installation, test it in multiple versions. Like I test every control of everything I'm building, and that doesn't mean that there will never be bugs, there will never be revisions. Like that is part of the process too. But I think that the big point is like when you're building it, you're the first line of defense, and you should try to fix everything before ever giving it to a client.
All right, sounds good. You mentioned earlier how you basically immediately work within After Effects, and I understand MOGRTs is basically an Adobe concept, After Effects, Premiere. But are there any other technology outside Adobe that's somehow similar to MOGRTs that you're exploring or you use to work?
For me, no. Like I've used a lot of the other tools, like Cavalry. Cavalry was really cool. I was using it when it first came out. I think it still has a lot of potential. But at the end of the day, most of the teams I work with are using Adobe software. So they need things that work in the Adobe suite. They need After Effects files. They need Premiere Pro files. Cavalry is great and it's really cool, but it's not there yet. Fable, right? Like, is a great example of a piece of software that was gaining steam. Motion designers liked it, but at the end of the day, the company shut down. They didn't have the runway to keep existing. So I'm not going to invest a bunch of time to learn tools that aren't going to be around 3 years from now. And so for my work, I mostly focus on After Effects and Premiere. And, it's great that people are excited about other tools. And I want more tools in this landscape, but I'm not going to jump ship and start learning them until clients are really demanding them. So for me, it's After Effects, Premiere, and I guess the thing is, though, I'm not just using the default versions of After Effects and Premiere. The great thing about Adobe software is all plugins and scripts and that whole ecosystem. So I'm using dozens of plugins and scripts every single day that make my workflow better for general motion design and also for building templates and toolkits and automating things. The only tool that I use outside of Premiere and After Effects regularly is VS Code, because for coding and development, that is my preferred piece of software. And even if I'm writing expressions in After Effects, if it's a particularly complex, piece of code expression, then sometimes I'll write that in VS Code because it's just a better environment.
Yeah. So I was going to touch on creative coding in the future, but I guess since you've gone there, let's just go there. So I'm actually personally curious about how you would combine, because I have a background in computer science, so I have some knowledge of coding, but once I got into motion design, I would say I dropped that. So how do you like marry both, and how does it really make you create much more functional results? That's having knowledge of and applying both design and coding.
Yeah, definitely. I only learned coding because I was using After Effects. And at the end of the day, there were a lot of things in After Effects that I got tired of doing by hand. And so it was through, very basic experimentation years ago of like pick whipping things together. That way, two controls are moving at the same time, or copying and pasting expressions I found online to do, an automatic bounce or automatic wiggle or whatever. And then over time, learning how that stuff actually works and being able to write them on my own and being able to write like really sophisticated code to automate things. And so most of the time I'm writing expressions to rig things together so that I don't have to do them by hand, because it's a pain in the butt to manage hundreds of layers and keyframes, and it's way better to be able to rig them together automatically. And in understanding how to rig things together and how expressions work, it totally changed the way that I build in After Effects. Because if I know that I need to write certain expressions and to rig layers together a certain way, then I'm pre-planning and building my layers, knowing that I'll write expressions to rig them together later on.
Yeah. Oh, sounds good. So would you say, now with building motion design systems and MOGRTs and toolkits, would you say a designer who doesn't have like in-depth knowledge about coding and expressions, do you think that designer will be limited in creating like good work or his best work?
No, I don't think so. I think that especially with motion design systems, a lot of it just comes down to design and to taste. And I think that if you're too focused on the coding side and like rigging things together and you're thinking too far ahead, that can really limit your design sense. And so I think that a lot of the best designers that I know don't do any coding, development, whatever, because they're focused on, does it look good? Does it move right? And they're not worried about, can I automate all this stuff? Like, they're just going to add layers and add pieces together to make it look the best. And then someone else like me can come in and be like, all right, this looks great. I love your design. Now let me try to rebuild it if I need to, and then tie things together with expressions or whatever. And I think that that's often the best, is when you have two people working in tandem.
Okay, yeah, I think that approach that makes sense actually. With regards to documentation, because the picture is especially on a higher scale, larger scale, which you create MOGRTs for. The picture is you create a lot of things. So how do you go about documenting? So when I create projects, right, there's the conflict between, do I document as I go, or probably when I'm done, I just document, or like, how does documentation work for you when, for clients and probably for yourself, future use and all?
Sure. Yeah, documentation is a fun topic. So for a lot of the toolkits I'm building and a lot of the templates I'm building, we don't need documentation. And especially if it's a smaller project or like just a bundle of MOGRTs, I think that documentation is only necessary if you built it wrong. Because most of the time I'm building things that are intuitive enough that you can just drop onto the timeline and use, or just open the project file and use right away. And they should be self-explanatory. Like, I don't want someone to have to open a PDF and read a bunch of pages in order to use the template. They should be able to just open the template and use it. That said, if it is a particularly complex project, like let's say it's an After Effects toolkit with a bunch of different comps, that can be more elaborate. And in that case, I'll add guide layers, or I'll add like a single master comp that has some basic instructions. But I don't go crazy adding like comments everywhere and extra layers, because that stuff gets more confusing. Like, it's better to just build a clear template rather than have a ton of extra documentation pointing places.
Oh, it sounds good. I think your approach, I would actually try guide layers. I haven't thought about it, using it for documentation. But yeah, thanks for that. So I would move into Captioneer. I mean, I would call it your baby. We've discussed how you create your code yourself. Do you create Captioneer from scratch yourself, or do you collaborate with a team? How, and what even came about? Was it like you encountered a problem within Premiere and you decided to create something to solve it, or how did it come about also?
Yeah, Captioneer is a big collaboration project. I started Captioneer like 2 or 3 years ago now. And I did some of the work myself on the development. And then I started working with external developers as it got bigger and more complicated. So most recently, I worked with Motionland, creator of AE Viewer. And we have really built this project from scratch, from the ground up together, based mainly on my vision for it. And he's been a fantastic partner on this project, but it's really been my baby and my perspective on the workflow and the design and all of that. So because I have the development experience and I have a lot of experience with Premiere and After Effects, I knew what was possible in terms of the scripting and the extension world and what we could build, what was technically feasible. And I built some small pieces. And then Motionland, Alex, built the extension from scratch himself. And it's amazing. And we still work together and are doing updates constantly.
Yeah, sounds good. So I guess, how do you stay inspired to keep your design fresh within? So this is not a niche we have. well, based on my experience, this is not a niche you have so many people, so many designers in. So how do you, and you could correct me on that if I'm wrong, but it's just based on my experience. So how do you now keep that freshness and keep wanting to continue within this particular niche, even having been doing it for a number of years now?
Yeah. For most of my client work, there's not a lot of design decisions that I'm making. Most client work is pretty straightforward. Like they have brand guides, they have fonts, they have colors. I'm often working with other designers and other editors and other people. Like we're all in the mix together. So it's it's very rare that I'm building a toolkit or a template from scratch and just like any design goes. Very rare. Most of the time, it's really just following what is needed for that project, right? Like if you're building templates for Netflix or Google, like you know what that looks like. So it's really just following what is needed for the project.
Yeah, sounds good. So what common challenges do you face while creating MOGRTs and toolkits? Or would I say what's your biggest challenge in your years of experience?
Yeah. Okay. I think that the biggest challenge is communicating with the client and figuring out what is possible versus what isn't possible. And, just as often as a client thinks this thing that we want to build is not possible and we have to do it by hand, and you can come in and educate them and say, hey, actually, you don't have to do that by hand. We can build a template for that, or we could totally automate that, or we could write a script that does that for you. Like that happens all the time where I'm educating a client on like, hey, we can automate or really speed up your workflow by doing this. But just as often as that happens, a client will ask, hey, we want to do this other thing, and this should be possible. We should be able to automate this. And sometimes you have to educate them on the way the programs work, the way Adobe software works, and those things aren't always possible. And so that sort of back and forth and communication with the client of, hey, I want to help improve your workflow as much as possible, but not everything you want under the sun can be automated. That's the biggest challenge. And then I think another one that sort of goes in line with that is render time. And so building projects in After Effects, like After Effects is a notoriously slow piece of software. Doesn't matter if you're on Mac or PC, it's slow. So yeah. So that's a big thing too is, sometimes a client wants to pack just a ton of stuff or a ton of designs, or they want to mix 2D and 3D and they want to mix layered PSDs in an After Effects file and export that as a MOGRT to use in Premiere. And then they're like, oh, hey, can we use this in Canva? And you just have to educate them like, hey, like this is not how this workflow works. Pare it down. Here's what we can do instead. Maybe split this stuff out. Maybe simplify the design. Maybe just render some videos out instead of using templates for everything. And so that's the big challenge, is communicating with clients on like what is technically possible and what is the best way to solve the problem. Because sometimes they self-prescribe and say like, oh, we want a template for this, or like this is the best way to go about this workflow. And then I come in and look at it and I'm like, actually, we could write a script that automates this whole process and you don't have to sit there and like type in After Effects.
Yeah. Yeah. The follow up will be, since you highlight communicating with the client as it's a big issue generally. How did you go about, would I say, getting better in communicating because I feel you won't be able to create your best work if you and your clients are not on the same page, or if you're unable to communicate your idea well, you feel like you're just being pushed to do something you don't want to do. So how did you go about getting better in maneuvering the challenge of communicating with a client?
Yeah, it's a learning process for sure. I think it's something that you just get better by doing over time. And by communicating early, it's better to over communicate. rather than under communicate. In the past, I've definitely like tried to just solve everything on my own and then deliver it to a client at the end. And then in that last conversation, we discover that this was the wrong approach, or this, doesn't solve the problem. And then we have to go back and redo things. And so it's experiences like that I learned it's way better to communicate early. That's like what I was talking about before, of auditing a project up front, discussing things up front, because you don't want to start building something, especially with development and with coding, if like the design is going to change, because then you're going to have to rip all that stuff out and then rewrite those expressions or those codes. So it's really important to communicate early. And then the other thing that I think helped a lot in learning how to communicate with clients is actually hiring people on my own. So the last few years in working on bigger projects, I was hiring illustrators and animators and developers to help with projects on my own. And seeing where someone is successful versus where I feel frustrated as the client, that taught me a lot about what's important. And so I think that some of the keys are like, it's not a big deal if you're having trouble or you're stuck or you have a question. To me, when I've hired people, the biggest problem is when you agree on a deadline and then that deadline comes and goes, there's no communication, or you ask for one thing and they deliver something completely different. Like, those are big things to avoid. And a lot of that comes down to just communication and following through with what you said.
Mm-hmm. Good. Sounds good. I think I'll just run through before we go to the demo. What would you say are skill sets a motion designer needs to have to be good at MOGRTs and eventually toolkits?
Sure. I think that the most important skill set for someone who's wanting to get into MOGRTs and toolkits is patience. This stuff takes a lot of time. Like, this is not something that you can work on and watch TV and be distracted and like work on for 20 minutes and have it be done. Like, I will spend hours and hours and hours and days working on projects because it's, technically complex, takes a lot of attention. And you're often redoing work like over and over to get to a polished final result. And sometimes you have to throw out work that you spent a lot of time on because there's a better approach. So I think that being really patient and being extremely detail oriented are the most important factors when you're getting into MOGRTs and toolkits. Being really organized and communicating really effectively with clients, getting back to the idea of like, don't build in a direction that the client doesn't want you to go in.
Yeah. You mentioned sometimes you build projects and you have to change because there's a better approach. Have you had that experience? How was it? Because I'm imagining it would have been frustrating.
Yeah. That sort of happens all the time in two ways. And so like, I try to minimize this as much as possible, but it does happen where I'll start working on a project, I'll start building something, and then the client comes back and says, hey, we have a different design. Or, we know you spent 3 days on this, but we have an updated After Effects project file. Can you just port everything over? But everything's changed in the project file, right? Or maybe I had already started rebuilding things because it was built inefficiently in the first place. And so then you basically have to throw out those days of work because you're going backwards in the process. You're going back to the design phase. And so that's step one, is like making sure that all the designs are approved before you start building on top of them, turning them into toolkits and templates. And then the other one is in terms of throwing things out. Like, a lot of times with coding and with expressions, like, I'll spend hours working on coding something a certain way, and then step away, have a coffee, have some food, come back and realize, oh, wait a second, there's a much easier way to do this, and then rewrite it a totally different way. And you're essentially throwing out that work, but it's not like it was a waste of time because you needed to go through that work to get to the end result anyway.
Yeah, true that. Yeah. Sounds good. Sounds good. So let's get to the meat. We'd like to see a demo of some MOGRT toolkits. Yeah. So just hand over to you here.
Yeah, I can do that. I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So we've been talking about MOGRTs and toolkits and all this stuff. So I figured, why not show you some templates and toolkits that I really like. These are all a few years old at this point, but these are still some cool pieces. So here we're in Premiere, and we'll start off with this one. And I have this MOGRT in the timeline where this text comes down, and then it shows this line of text. And if I just play this back, then we can see the animation. So pretty simple, but this is built as a MOGRT. It's not pre-rendered. So what we can do is we can change whatever this says. Go behind the scenes, go behind the streams. And this whole MOGRT is procedural, so it will all update. And so that's like the basic control. But then there's also some other things in here. So like we can randomize the fill of all these letters. Or we can randomize these other flashing letters. And so, you know, it's an easy way to just have varied animation in Premiere rather than having to go back to the motion designer and having these things pre-rendered or having to do them by hand. Like this would be a huge pain to do by hand for every different bit of text, but it wasn't too hard to program procedurally and then build as a MOGRT. And of course we have some other basic things like colors and stroke width. But this one's pretty simple. The next one is another one that's pretty simple where it's just this text typing on. And actually I'll cut this so it's a little shorter. So this one is just the search bar, but we can reposition it or we can scale everything. But the main one is we can change the text. So tell us everything about working with Taylor Swift. Tell us everything about working with Dave Chappelle. And then the, what's it called? The search box is going to update its size and all of that text will still type on fine. And if we change this to something way shorter, then, you know, then it still is typing on and everything is reflowing and resizing. And then we could change the width, add some difference here, add some padding or decrease it. So really some like basic controls. And this is another one that, you know, it's pretty easy to build as an After Effects template and then manually change these things, but it's great to be able to change them in literal seconds inside Premiere. And of course it's transparent, so you could put it on footage. Okay, the next two are way more exciting, way more elaborate. So I'll drag this one and I'll select this one here and I'll play this. So this is a split screen MOGRT that I built like 3 years ago for a Netflix team. So we have this like spinning loading animation and then some key art and some information about this show, Russian Doll. And then on the right, this is actually transparent, so you could place footage here. So if I show you what that looks like, we can drag this clip below here and scale it up. And so this is like the intended use case where you have talent talking and you have the MOGRT sort of split screen. But what's also cool about this one is, well, I guess a lot of things. So first of all, we can flip it from left to right. So I'll flip it to the right, and then we can move this other clip over. And there we go. Now we have this other look. But also in the same template, we can change the aspect ratio. So here, if I change our settings, 1080 and 1920, in this same MOGRT, we have a vertical setup, and we have a 1x1 setup. And what you can see is all these elements, it's all the same elements, but they've reflowed, right? So like the layout is different for 16:9 versus 9:16. So I'll change this back to 1920, 1080. But this is a MOGRT. It's not static. So all of these things are also editable. So drag our properties panel over here, and in our search bar, I'll write love, death, and robots. So that's going to update. Our key art, we can drag around, and that's this section right here. So I'll go ahead and drag a different show onto that media replacement, and then it replaces in that section. The logo also needs to be updated, which I have here. So we can drop the logo on. That's updated for a brand new show. Additionally, we have our play menu, which we can turn on and off. And then we can see that the logo is like reflowing, right? Like, and these are decisions that the editor doesn't have to think about and make. We don't have a bunch of sliders and a bunch of crazy options that they have to do things manually. It's just one checkbox, turn it off, turn it on. Match and ratings. Again, like all of these elements here, we can change. So there's selections for the ratings. We can change the year. That stuff will all reflow all together. Got a slider for the match percentage. We could say 1 season, 2 seasons, whatever. Turn this last logo off and on. Show description. And then here, this is the summary down here. So a show about like cyberpunk, dystopian, robots, and stuff. Okay, so I've updated this MOGRT for Love, Death, and Robots. We still have all the same controls of the left and right and the aspect ratio. So you can see that as I change that to the 1x1, then all those elements reflow. We don't have to worry about it. And I can reset it right back to what it was by going to graphics, reset all parameters, and it's reset. So yeah, so this is a MOGRT that I really like, that I think is really cool because it has all of these features built in, and it can be used in a bunch of different ways. And we can replace our footage. So there. So yeah, super, super straightforward. This was more complex to build, but also like totally possible. And this is like 3 years old, so you can do even more today. And then I have one more that I'll show you because I also really like this one. So this one, I'll play this back. It's this rollover animation where the cursors are rolling over, but this is also a MOGRT. It's not pre-rendered. So if we open the properties, then we have a few different styles in here. So if I change that, then it's going to change the cursor animation. And so there's 4 different cursor animations built in here. Again, we could change the thing at the top, Dave Chappelle. And then each of these thumbnails, we can change this metadata. So just like the other one where we could change the rating and the seasons and all that stuff. This one also has those controls. So 1, 2, 3. So this is going to be this one. So if we change this, then this updates inside the card. And that's the same for all these styles. So if we change the style, then we can see that it's updating for that correct style. And again, all these same controls, match percentage, whatever. And then this one's kind of fun. Down here at the bottom, see it says slick, suspenseful, satire. That's meant to be the genre of the show. So we could change this to fun. And then I'll add a slash, family friendly. And then it's adding a dot and separating those into different layers so the design looks good. Suspense, whatever. And so each of those cards has all of those controls. But then lastly, in this template, all of these cards, all these thumbnails are replaceable. So these thumbnails aren't just static. We can replace them with any shows to keep it current. So if I go ahead and select a bunch of thumbnails, we can drop those all in at once, and they all update. And the animation still plays back pretty much in real time on pretty low-end machines. And all of that information is still updating perfectly fine. There we go. And each of these are organized. So for example, if I want to change out like this Tiger King one, then that is going to be in row 2. So we can go to row 2 and then just count 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So 9. And then we can go ahead and pick a thumbnail. So I'll pick something that's not in here, Arrested Development, drop that on, and that targets this one. So it's very organized. It's not just like drop on whatever. You can really make this your own. And lastly, the big thing is that this is not just 16 by 9. So same as before where it has all the other aspect ratios, this one can be changed. And it maintains all of those settings that we had before. So I'll change this. And there we go. We can see the 9 by 16 design. Or the square design. And, it has all of the updates. So these are two like more sophisticated MOGRTs that I think are pretty sweet, and can be used, dozens of times. So it's not just like you build it once and you're done. Yeah. I think that's all the demos I got. Do you have any questions about these or have anything you want to like talk about based on these?
Yeah, I think what stands out mostly for me is, definitely it's really organized. What stands out for me is the aspect ratio, being able to, that's a challenge generally with motion design, having to create the same animation, different dimensions. But this actually is really, really awesome. Yeah, it's all good. I get that. So it's actually, I've seen a couple of things I'm definitely going to try out with Creating MOGRTs, and hopefully someone who watches this would be able to do that also. Thank you so much. This was helpful.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Let me stop the screen share. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, man. It was super fun to talk. And
same here.
Yeah, I hope that this is helpful for your audience, and I hope that people are excited about building toolkits, and especially MOGRTs. I think MOGRTs are still really untapped and really powerful. And I was trying to show with those demos, like how much you can do with them. It's not just like replace some text. You can do really elaborate things. So that's really what I wanted to show off.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I will definitely do a great job in highlighting that part so it's not lost in the entire interview. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for coming up. I really enjoyed this session and I learned a lot. I'm still definitely going to rewatch the episodes to get more, and it was really awesome.
Thanks, man. Yeah, it was great talking to you too. Thanks for having me on. And yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, thank you.